Huge shakeup at Ferrari. Frederic Vasseur has been suddenly dismissed to make room for Christian Horner's arrival at the team. If you want to know all the details about his conversation with Lewis Hamilton, stay tuned until the end. This video is just for you. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. After enduring an extended period characterized by uncertainty, fragmented authority, and a noticeable decline in internal cohesion, Ferrari's senior leadership ultimately executed a decision that many had quietly anticipated but few expected so soon: the termination of Frederic Vasseur's tenure as the guiding force behind their Formula One operations. This wasn't a reactionary response to race-by-race fluctuations, nor was it driven solely by statistics. It stemmed from an accumulation of unresolved frictions, deteriorating intra-team trust, and a gradual unraveling of unity within the organization. More than anything, the fracture between Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc, two drivers at the pinnacle of talent but increasingly at odds in philosophy, support, and treatment, had grown so deep that it jeopardized the functionality of the entire structure. The relationship between both sides of the garage had transformed from competitive tension into silent opposition, undermining every layer of collaboration necessary for long-term success. Ferrari, long known for its romanticism and its reverence for legacy, recognized it could no longer rely on tradition to preserve control. The hierarchy had grown concerned not just about the on-track execution, but about the invisible walls being erected between departments, the whispers of favoritism that never seemed to go away, and the palpable unease surrounding Hamilton's presence within a team that had been architected around Leclerc for years. Every new chassis iteration, every telemetry briefing, every race strategy meeting seemed to widen the rift rather than bridge it. There was no longer a shared sense of purpose, just two diverging paths competing under one emblem. And that imbalance wasn't just hurting results, it was eroding Ferrari's identity as a unified challenger in a grid of hyper-organized rivals. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. In this storm, Ferrari reached out to an individual who had built his career on navigating chaos, neutralizing internal resistance, and extracting performance through uncompromising clarity: Christian Horner. Leaving behind decades of dominance and institutional stability at Red Bull, Horner's transition to Maranello was nothing short of monumental. It signaled a complete pivot in Ferrari's management style, an embrace of structure, discipline, and control over sentiment and legacy-based favoritism. Horner didn't arrive to maintain peace. He came to reassert authority, break down unproductive alliances, and instill a singular directive: win through merit, not through manipulation. One of Horner's first actions was to initiate a dialogue that had been avoided for far too long. He arranged a confidential, unscheduled meeting with Hamilton, far from the media, race engineers, or PR teams. This wasn't a tactical session or a formal check-in, it was an unfiltered conversation between two veterans of the sport, both acutely aware of the unspoken tensions that had derailed their paths for years. Inside the soundproofed walls of Ferrari's most secure office, Horner offered Hamilton what no one else at the team had: full transparency. He didn't dance around the issues. He outlined the sequence of decisions, the internal structures, and the quiet efforts that had been undertaken to subtly favor Leclerc, not in the open, but through nuanced differences in component availability, aero testing priorities, simulator scheduling, and briefing content. The mechanics of the bias were carefully hidden but deeply impactful, and Horner explained how these embedded preferences had compromised Hamilton's capacity to compete on equal ground. For Hamilton, the admission wasn't a surprise. It was a confirmation of months of suspicion and personal doubt. He had long noticed disparities in preparation windows, minor yet consistent anomalies in strategic decisions, and an overall tone that placed him on the outside of key operational choices. But hearing it acknowledged so directly, and from someone now holding executive power, shifted the entire context of his presence within the team. It was no longer just about interpretation, it became factual. Horner didn't apologize for the past. Instead, he offered resolution. He laid out a plan to restructure key technical departments, reassign individuals who had blurred the lines between professional responsibility and personal allegiance, and rebuild the decision-making framework with clarity and equality at its core. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. The changes began swiftly. Access to data logs, simulator configurations, and wind tunnel results were rebalanced across both sides of the garage. Strategic meetings were reformatted to ensure parity in representation and voice. Internal audits were launched to trace communication patterns and resource distribution. The objective wasn't revenge, it was restoration. Horner aimed to eliminate the factions that had taken root, neutralize influence networks that favored familiarity over competence, and re-establish performance as the sole currency of advancement within the team. Leclerc, though still viewed as an integral asset, was no longer shielded from the competitive process. His insights remained valuable, but his preferential treatment was quietly revoked. The buffers he had grown accustomed to, exclusive access to early simulations, pre-release upgrades, and unilateral feedback loops, were dismantled. Every driver input now passed through a centralized evaluation process. Every engineering recommendation required cross-validation. The favoritism that had previously distorted the team's decision tree was replaced by rigorous oversight and meritocratic accountability. Beyond personnel, Horner sought to realign Ferrari's broader strategy with a more pragmatic, results-driven outlook. The emotional legacy of the team, the very thing that made Ferrari iconic, had, over time, blurred its focus. Under Horner, that sentimentality was pared back. Emphasis shifted to operational discipline, predictive modeling, and scenario optimization. Technical staff were retrained in leaner processes. Team operations were refined using efficiency metrics rather than tradition. The wind tunnel program was recalibrated to match track-specific targets instead of conceptual development arcs. Pit crews underwent simulation-intensive drills to remove micro-errors that had accumulated over time. Every facet of the team's performance model was re-engineered to operate at maximum responsiveness. Hamilton, reintegrated into a team finally willing to embrace his input without skepticism, responded with renewed intensity. His feedback began shaping car evolution without delay. His Racecraft, long underutilized in previous seasons due to internal constraints, was once again central to strategic calculations. For the first time since arriving at Maranello, Hamilton was no longer a guest, he was a cornerstone. And with Horner behind the scenes, every layer of Ferrari's machinery began turning in rhythm toward a singular aim. The transformation wasn't without turbulence. Resentment lingered among some factions, especially those who had benefited from the old structure. Resistance appeared in subtle forms, pushback on procedural changes, attempts to bypass the new approval chain, but each was methodically dismantled. Horner didn't tolerate ambiguity. He installed mechanisms to detect irregularities, enforced compliance with new protocols, and ensured that every department understood the cost of undermining team alignment. Gradually, the noise faded. Those unwilling to adapt found themselves reassigned or replaced. Those committed to the renewed vision flourished. As the season wore on, Ferrari's internal temperature changed. Conversations became more focused. Objectives were clearer. Results started trending upward, not necessarily through podium domination, but through the reduction of self-inflicted wounds. The car's reliability improved. Strategy calls grew sharper. Coordination between track and factory reached levels not seen in years. The gap between potential and execution narrowed, not by chance, but through deliberate recalibration. In this new reality, Ferrari no longer functioned as two opposing teams within a single operation. It moved forward with one purpose, one structure, one plan. The process of repairing trust, restoring fairness, and establishing competitive clarity was still ongoing, but the foundation had been laid. And under Horner's command, powered by Hamilton's resilience and reawakened drive, the Scuderia once again became a threat, not just to its rivals, but to the legacy of its own past failures. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. From the earliest races of the season, subtle modifications have been introduced to Leclerc's machine that went unnoticed by many within the team, especially by Hamilton's crew. Among the most significant of these enhancements was a re-engineered rear linkage system that altered the mechanical behavior of the car mid-corner. This allowed Leclerc to apply throttle earlier without destabilizing the chassis, a feature particularly effective in medium-speed sequences where traction limitations were critical. This configuration had never been trialed on Hamilton's car, nor was it referenced in any of the shared setup archives or technical briefings that were supposed to ensure cross-car parity. Hamilton had begun sensing inconsistencies early on. His post-session debriefs were riddled with contradictions. What he felt behind the wheel didn't match the numbers he was shown. The balance shifts he experienced under braking, the traction variation from session to session, the inexplicably quick degradation of tires. None of it made sense given the effort he and his engineers had put into optimization. And yet, when he questioned the patterns, his concerns were answered with generic explanations about external variables. Wind, track evolution, ambient temperature, or vague driver adaptation issues. Behind the scenes, a restricted cluster of performance developers had been operating with authority that exceeded their apparent roles. This group had direct communication lines to Leclerc's strategists and received alternate simulations from the factory that were never relayed to Hamilton's side. New cooling ducts, refined floor edges, and revised rear-wing elements were being cycled through Leclerc's car under the classification of test components, which conveniently allowed them to be excluded from official update documentation. These components, once validated, often never made it to the sister car at all. The disparity extended to software configurations as well. Leclerc had access to a dynamic throttle mapping system that learned from his inputs in real time and modified torque response accordingly. Though legal under current regulations, this algorithm had been coded into the car's control systems exclusively on his side. Meanwhile, Hamilton was running a less adaptive version of the same map, one that didn't allow the same level of traction fine-tuning through complex corner exits. This affected acceleration consistency, particularly on circuits with low-grip surfaces, and subtly undermined his confidence when pushing to the limit. Data segregation became the defining symptom of this internal imbalance. Hamilton's performance engineers began noticing gaps in telemetry files. Certain traces, such as rear ride height under load or real-time ERS efficiency output, were missing. Requests for full comparative datasets were either denied or delayed indefinitely, justified with excuses about corrupted files or server issues. Eventually, some began pulling data from back-channel sources, unofficial logs maintained by concerned analysts who had seen enough to know something was wrong. It wasn't until Horner confronted the issue directly that the full extent came to light. Following a quiet audit initiated after he assumed command, he uncovered layers of internal documentation that painted a disturbing picture. There were development cycles listed as experimental, which had been fast-tracked into Leclerc's race weekends. Sensor recalibrations marked as temporary tests had remained active on Car 16 for months. Energy recovery schedules had been manually tweaked to provide bursts of additional electrical power just before DRS zones, optimizations Leclerc's engineers treated as baseline, while Hamilton's team remained completely unaware of their existence. Upon receiving a compiled analysis, gathered by a network of whistleblowers and quietly verified through encrypted channels, Hamilton was faced with a timeline of manipulation. He saw how his simulations had been rerouted through outdated parameters, how mid-race strategy shifts were decided without his input, and how tire performance models had been adjusted post-hoc to justify slower stints. The evidence didn't just suggest preference, it revealed orchestration. It was the accumulation of small, targeted decisions that ultimately had the greatest effect. Hamilton had not been outperformed in a vacuum. He had been systematically constrained, restricted, and misled. His car had been built under the illusion of parity, when in reality it had been a secondary platform in both development and deployment. What appeared as statistical underperformance was, in truth, the result of internal manipulation designed to elevate one driver while masking the disadvantage of the other. Horner, far from simply exposing the situation, laid out a structural overhaul of the way the team operated. He abolished the compartmentalized data silos, mandated uniform testing of all upgrades on both vehicles, and initiated a live oversight protocol to flag any discrepancies in software deployment, aerodynamic packages, or telemetry access in real time. No system would exist in isolation, and no component would be fitted to one car without the knowledge and consent of the entire technical division. For Hamilton, this reckoning was both vindication and devastation. He had poured everything into this chapter of his career, every ounce of discipline, every moment of belief in something greater than individual glory. He had carried the weight of Ferrari's legacy with the intention of writing his own chapter in its history, only to realize that the foundation had been compromised from the beginning. It wasn't failure that haunted him, it was betrayal. Not from the fans, or the sport, or the machinery, but from those inside his own camp, operating with agendas that had nothing to do with merit or fairness. Yet through the smoke of anger and disbelief emerged something deeper, resolve. With the barriers torn down, and the truth finally out in the open, Hamilton stood no longer as a victim of sabotage, but as a competitor reborn. The obstacles he faced had not broken him, they had sharpened his awareness and reignited his drive. He would no longer race under illusion. Every lap forward would be fought with clarity, guided by transparency, and fueled by the quiet fire of a man who had survived deceit and emerged more dangerous than ever. In the days that unfolded after his arrival, Christian Horner began a deliberate and intense reconfiguration of Ferrari's internal ecosystem, targeting long-standing inefficiencies and embedded biases that had quietly hindered the team's progress. His approach was not impulsive or driven by optics. It was calculated, strategic, and aimed at fundamentally redefining how Ferrari operated at every level. One of his earliest actions involved initiating a quiet yet firm reshuffling of leadership positions across departments closely connected to Leclerc's side of operations. These individuals, many of whom had been in place for years, had gradually formed informal structures of influence that shaped technical decisions in ways that were neither transparent nor consistent with team-wide progress. Their removal, although discreetly managed, sent an unmistakable message: alignment with a single driver's agenda would no longer supersede the collective mission. Horner followed this by reinforcing key departments with trusted external analysts, professionals with reputations for diagnostic accuracy and uncompromising objectivity. These consultants had deep experience in aerodynamic modeling, flow behavior under stress, and turbulence management during unstable transitions. Rather than push for immediate conceptual innovations, they were instructed to conduct granular audits of existing systems, analyzing air displacement under rapid directional shifts, evaluating component harmonics under vertical load, and cross-referencing data from wind tunnel simulations with on-track inconsistencies. This analytical rigor began to expose minor discrepancies in the car's behavior. Discrepancies that, while small in isolation, had compounded across race weekends to create significant unpredictability for the drivers. Simultaneously, Horner initiated a methodical reworking of how feedback was processed, removing the silos that had long allowed each side of the garage to function as an independent entity. Under previous leadership, Hamilton and Leclerc often operated within separate data ecosystems, using different performance algorithms, unique data filtering tools, and variant simulation outputs that created diverging interpretations of the car's capabilities. Horner dismantled this fragmentation by mandating a unified analytics core, a centralized feedback loop where both drivers' input would be measured through identical modeling parameters and predictive sequences. This wasn't merely a shift in procedure. It was a recalibration of how trust was engineered between human feedback and machine learning. The driving simulator, once a tool tailored individually for each driver's tendencies, was transformed into a harmonized testing platform. Developers were instructed to build a synchronized baseline model that accurately reflected the physical car's latest configuration in every detail, from suspension dynamics to airflow disturbance under slipstream conditions. Both drivers now worked within the same digital ecosystem, experiencing the same tire degradation profiles, power unit responses, and energy deployment strategies. This change eliminated the possibility of one driver benefiting from subtler, less measurable simulator enhancements, and ensured that both were entering race weekends with parity in virtual preparation. Another crucial change implemented by Horner involved restructuring how car improvements were introduced and communicated. Historically, upgrades had often been released in staggered phases, sometimes prioritized for one garage based on earlier feedback loops or strategic preferences. Horner replaced this approach with a formalized rollout mechanism. Every part, whether it involved minor weight redistribution or a re-engineered cooling channel, was now shared through synchronized technical briefings, attended by both drivers, senior engineers, and performance analysts. These sessions weren't just visual presentations. They were structured dialogues where projected outcomes, setup implications, and test scenarios were discussed with complete transparency. Each meeting was documented, creating a growing repository of decision-making logic that would guide future updates. Beneath these procedural overhauls was an even deeper focus on the core of the SF25's design, a platform that had shown moments of brilliance but often failed to deliver predictable responses under fluctuating conditions. Horner suspected that the issues went beyond aero balance or surface-level setup. He launched a comprehensive physical assessment of the car's monocoque, load-bearing components, and structural resilience under asymmetric forces. Using advanced vibration mapping and load response diagnostics, his team identified nonlinear flex points in the chassis that subtly altered tire contact patches under heavy braking and quick steering inputs, factors that critically undermined Hamilton's aggressive driving profile, which depends on immediate grip recovery and responsive rotation. To counter this, Horner approved a series of structural modifications focused on creating a more coherent feedback loop between chassis flex, suspension compression, and floor pressure. The floor was redeveloped with new airflow diffusers and dynamic edge contours that preserved aerodynamic grip even when the car was unsettled. This design, tailored to support Hamilton's forceful entry points and swift direction changes, was stress-tested in a controlled track environment and then validated through telemetry that demonstrated improved cornering stability and reduced rear-end unpredictability. In a prolonged engineering debrief, Horner and Hamilton sat side by side, reviewing every variable introduced in the updated setup. Together they dissected sector differentials, compared torque consistency across corner types, and analyzed throttle recovery patterns after sharp deceleration. There was no managerial distance, just technical alignment. For Hamilton, who had spent over a year navigating a political maze within Ferrari's hierarchy, the shift was profound. He wasn't being consulted for appearance's sake, he was actively shaping the vehicle's evolution. His feedback was implemented, validated, and recalibrated with a level of seriousness that had long been absent from his Maranello experience. On the other side of the garage, Leclerc experienced this transformation with a growing awareness that the old balance of influence had been redefined. The exclusive channels of input that once guided design emphasis toward his preferences were now replaced with shared accountability. No more private component tests. No more early access to experimental setups. All developments, no matter how nuanced, were subject to joint scrutiny, backed by data, and distributed in full view of both camps. This shift did not undermine Leclerc's role. Rather, it placed him on equal footing within a structure governed by merit, not legacy allegiance. The overall culture began to reflect this new architecture. Race weekend preparation evolved into a cooperative exercise in optimization. Engineers began cross-analyzing driver tendencies not to favor one style, but to enhance the car's universality. Tire telemetry was fed into a common dashboard where both sides could query compound behavior across identical stints. Brake wear models were reconstructed to reflect driver modulation differences without bias. Even the language within technical briefings shifted. Where once updates were described in relation to a specific pilot's handling preferences, they were now communicated in the context of dynamic behavior under consistent variables. Behind the scenes, a new rhythm developed, one built on precision, symmetry, and operational transparency. Instead of managing two separate programs under one badge, Ferrari was finally operating as a cohesive entity. And within that machinery, Hamilton began to find more than just technical satisfaction. He rediscovered his identity as a collaborative force, not just a contracted talent. The changes weren't loud or showy, but they were unrelenting in their impact, building a system in which every engineer, strategist, and driver understood that success would no longer be fragmented or conditional. It would be earned, together, through a single unified effort. As the months advanced, a subtle but undeniable change began to take shape around Charles Leclerc. The once familiar rhythm of his working environment was steadily unraveling. No grand announcements were made, yet the modifications were obvious to those paying attention. People he had leaned on, those who instinctively knew how to fine-tune the car to match his driving style, were no longer there. They had been quietly relocated or replaced by individuals who did not share the same history or unspoken understanding. The support structure that had been carefully built around him was being disassembled piece by piece, leaving behind a more clinical, distant system where his preferences no longer carried the same unspoken priority. This evolution in the team's configuration wasn't born out of crisis or rebellion, but rather from a calculated redirection. Internal meetings that once operated under an air of camaraderie had become more formal, more procedural. Sessions that had previously allowed space for instinct and gut feeling were now anchored entirely in telemetry charts and modeling projections. The spontaneous collaboration that once defined Leclerc's working relationship with his crew was increasingly absent. Decisions were now more layered, less personal. There was no need for explicit confirmation. The change in power dynamics was being communicated through silence, structure, and omission. Leclerc, attuned to the nuances of this transformation, responded not with protest but with increased intensity. He started attending more engineering meetings, occasionally extending them to the point of discomfort for those used to shorter, less confrontational exchanges. He began dissecting tire data mid-weekend, requesting real-time updates on airflow simulations, and asking for predictive analytics during race prep. His involvement became more detailed, more granular, but also more strained. There was a sense that he was fighting against an invisible current, trying to remain central in a framework that no longer revolved solely around him. His tone with the media shifted as well. Questions that once drew light-hearted, thoughtful responses now prompted guarded replies, sometimes edged with frustration. He was still a professional, still committed, still talented, but the warmth and ease that had once characterized his presence began to fade. Even his fans, watching from a distance, could sense the change. The Leclerc they admired remained intact, but the atmosphere surrounding him had cooled, the spotlight dimmed just slightly. Behind closed doors, Christian Horner continued orchestrating the redefinition of Ferrari's culture. His leadership was neither loud nor confrontational. It was deliberate and precise. While he publicly praised the team's unified efforts, he made no special efforts to reaffirm any driver's dominance. Instead, he reinforced the message that no single individual, no matter how gifted, would override the team's broader mission. Decisions were now guided by aggregate performance models, cross-driver feedback loops, and forward-looking simulations. No favoritism. No historical bias. Just results. This philosophical shift, though unspoken, reshaped the technical and strategic priorities within the factory. Design proposals were tested against a wider set of driver inputs. Car upgrades were tailored to suit a broader operating window. And feedback sessions became more collective, with fewer moments of individual spotlight. Engineers adapted. Programmers recalibrated. Everyone involved began contributing to a more distributed model of development, where the ecosystem did not depend on a single voice but thrived on variety and balance. Amidst this transition, Lewis Hamilton found himself re-engaged in ways few expected. Once burdened by the stagnation he felt in his previous environment, he now approached his work with fresh determination. Ferrari offered him not just a seat, but a challenge, one that reawakened his competitive instincts and engineering curiosity. No longer focused on legacy preservation, he immersed himself in the daily grind of car optimization. His questions became more technical. His observations, sharper. His presence in the factory, more consistent and proactive. He didn't just show up for scheduled simulator runs. He requested additional sessions to test unconventional setups. He pushed for trials with experimental configurations, wanting to explore areas the team had previously overlooked. In meetings, he would present detailed notes based on tire feedback from long-run simulations, often accompanied by suggestions that led to immediate, measurable improvements in traction control or brake modulation. The level of precision he brought, married with his experience, made a tangible impact. Perhaps most significantly, his communication with Horner became a crucial asset. It wasn't simply about debriefing after sessions. It was about forecasting performance trends, identifying systemic inefficiencies, and proposing long-term adjustments that aligned with evolving regulations and track-specific behavior. Their collaboration moved beyond race-by-race strategies. They were thinking in terms of seasonal arcs and development cycles. Their alignment grew so consistent that key decisions, ranging from energy deployment tactics to mid-season upgrade scheduling, were often finalized without needing extended deliberation. The respect Hamilton received from the technical team grew quickly. Designers began integrating his feedback into prototype models without hesitation. Pit crew members adjusted timing drills to match his race day rhythm. Even the analytics department began reworking certain KPIs to reflect performance metrics that aligned with his data preferences. Slowly but surely, his influence wasn't just acknowledged, it became instrumental. Externally, the public narrative was shifting. Media outlets began recalibrating their framing of Ferrari's hierarchy. No longer viewed as a team with a clear lead and a backup, it was now portrayed as a unit in strategic evolution, adapting to modern demands and recalibrating its priorities around versatility and consistency. Where Leclerc had once stood as the emotional core of Ferrari, Hamilton was now emerging as its technical compass, steering decisions with an uncanny blend of intuition and calculation. Within the paddock, teams and rivals began noticing the subtle transformation. Ferrari no longer responded to race weekends with reactive decisions tied to driver sentiment. Their calls were more calculated, their strategies less predictable, and their internal cohesion stronger than it appeared on the surface. It wasn't about who had seniority, it was about who delivered clarity, precision, and performance under pressure. This new era, while still forming, had already begun to redefine how the team functioned at its core. It wasn't a matter of dethroning one driver or replacing another. It was about shifting the axis of influence, quietly, methodically, toward a structure that valued adaptability over allegiance. And in that space, Hamilton thrived. Leclerc endured. Ferrari changed. When Christian Horner stepped into Ferrari, he wasn't just accepting a new challenge. He was stepping into a landscape frozen in ritual and smothered by its own grandeur. The team, once synonymous with dominance, had over time become entangled in layers of caution, trapped in a routine where progress was discussed more often than executed. Horner didn't just bring knowledge from years of leading Red Bull. He brought a refusal to accept stagnation. Instead of simply adjusting existing protocols, He tore down barriers that had long been accepted as immovable. Behind the closed doors of Maranello, he restructured not only workflows and strategies, but expectations, attitudes, and the very language of success. He did not arrive looking to blend in or pay homage to outdated models of leadership. What he installed was a culture where hierarchy served function, not pride. People were no longer judged by their tenure, but by their effectiveness. Meetings that used to revolve around reputation now centered on precision. Fear of accountability was replaced by a shared drive to push limits. Individuals who had once felt overlooked were given the platform to contribute fully. The atmosphere, once cautious and reactive, became focused and forward-facing. In Horner's system, every voice counted, but only performance made decisions. He didn't impose order, he encouraged excellence to emerge from within, built on communication and trust. Amid this shift, one name carried a unique weight: Lewis Hamilton. His arrival at Ferrari might have been seen by some as symbolic or sentimental, but Horner viewed it as a tactical move with enormous potential. Where others suspected decline, he recognized a rare opportunity. Hamilton wasn't a fading figurehead, he was an asset still capable of shaping race weekends with a level of craft and insight few could replicate. Years of navigating internal power struggles at Mercedes had worn down his influence, but not his ability. The speed was intact, the instincts still sharp, but what had been missing was an ecosystem that responded to his precision with the same urgency he demanded from himself. Under Horner, that dynamic changed instantly. Hamilton was not handed authority, he was encouraged to lead through presence and output. The feedback he provided wasn't buried in layers of discussion, it became a trigger for real development. Engineers responded. Strategists listened. The factory adapted. Hamilton was no longer a frustrated observer of his own career. He was now an integral architect of a renewed Ferrari. Every test session, every briefing, every lap reflected his fingerprints. The synergy between his experience and Horner's structural clarity created a foundation unlike anything Ferrari had seen in over a decade. The transformation was subtle in appearance but monumental in impact. Performance began to build not on sudden upgrades, but on understanding. Setups were refined more quickly. Weekend plans became more adaptable. The car's behavior became predictable in a way that inspired confidence. But more than that, the team itself began to believe again. Not in slogans or history books, but in what they were actively creating. The tension that once hovered around the garage, whispers of dysfunction, doubts about direction, was replaced by focus. The energy around the paddock began to change, not because of what was being said, but because of what was being delivered. Hamilton thrived in this clarity. For the first time in years, he didn't have to fight internal tides. His mind was unclouded, his rhythm uninterrupted. Every stint was crafted with intent, every move calculated with purpose. He wasn't trying to escape shadows, he was generating his own momentum. While others debated whether he was still capable, he simply performed, sharper and more assertive than ever. There was no overcompensation, no unnecessary aggression, just clean, relentless execution. He drove not out of urgency, but from alignment. Not to prove a point, but because for the first time in a long while, every element around him was functioning in concert with his own high standards. Ferrari, too, began to shift from survival to domination. The gaps in pit coordination narrowed. Reliability improved. Even the tone of communication changed, from cautious optimism to confident intent. What Horner brought wasn't just stability, it was cohesion. His presence served as a fuse for long-dormant ambition. There were no guarantees, no premature declarations, but there was movement. And movement, in Formula One, is everything. The momentum began to tilt in their favor, not because of luck or circumstance, but because each cog in the system was now tuned to the same rhythm. Together, Horner and Hamilton weren't reviving old legends, they were forming a new one. One not built on the past, but on the conviction that excellence isn't a memory, it's a process. In a sport where time moves fast and loyalty is fleeting, their collaboration stood out not for its noise, but for its precision. It wasn't about rewriting history. It was about making sure history wasn't the final word. And with every race, every podium, and every strategy that paid off, they reminded the world that when the right driver meets the right leader, even the weight of legacy becomes fuel, not baggage.